episode of my series called Engines of Metro North. Before we get started, I would like to thank all of you for the support on this series. I'm just going to keep making videos and I hope that you will keep watching them. And now without further ado, let's get on to the topic of this episode, the EMD FL9. In the 1950s, the New Haven Railroad was struggling and taking many cost-cutting measures that were short-sighted and sometimes dangerous. The railroad has just finished making the switch from steam to diesel power on its unelectrified lines. In the early 1900s, the New Haven Railroad was a pioneer in mainline electrification. However, the manager, Patrick B. McGinnis, wanted to abandon electrification north of Stamford as a cost-cutting measure. This was a change from the railroad's old point of view, as they previously wanted to extend the electrification from New York to Boston. Means traveling from Grand Central to Boston already required a locomotive change from electric to diesel power due to the restrictions on diesel engines operating in Grand Central Terminal. But with the cut in electrification due to take place shortly, this would mean that trains going as far as Bridgeport would require a locomotive change. So they found a solution: the EMD FL9, which would be capable of operating off of overrunning and underrunning third rail, and from its own diesel prime mover, therefore making the locomotive a 2-in-1 design. The locomotive also met the Park Avenue viaduct weight restrictions, and this, along with the third rail operation, allowed the locomotive to operate directly into Grand Central Terminal. Thus, the locomotive would allow trains out of Grand Central and New York Penn to reach faraway destinations of Boston and Springfield without the need for an engine change. However, the New Haven Railroad was planning on taking the FL9 even farther, by replacing every single electric locomotive in its fleet with an FL9, allowing for the electrification cutback to be done much more efficiently. The locomotive was purchased to solve the problems of the proposed electrification cutback, but as we know, this never actually happened, which negated the primary reason for purchasing the locomotives in the first place. The New Haven Railroad ordered 60 EMD FL9 locomotives. The new locomotives would be based on the EMD FP9, but with several modifications which increased their length and weight considerably. The orders would be delivered in 2 batches with 30 locomotives each. The first 30 locomotives had a Blomberg front truck and had an older V16 567C prime mover with 1,750 horsepower. These locomotives also had small DC pantographs to compensate for the loss of third rail contact over the numerous switches in Grand Central Terminal. They also had Hancock air whistles instead of conventional air horns. Here are a few samples. After the testing of the first batch of locomotives, the second batch would have many improvements. It had a newer EMD V16 567D1 prime mover and lacked the DC pantograph and Hancock air whistles with the earlier FL9s in favor of conventional air horns. All of the locomotives would be 59 feet long and weigh 287,000 pounds. The FL9s rode on a rather uncommon B-A-1A wheel arrangement, meaning that the front truck would have 2 axles and the rear one would have 3, with only the outer 2 receiving power. The middle one was unpowered. This uncommon wheel arrangement was due to the FL9's increased weight over the FP9. The FL9 also had a flexicoil type truck, as these trucks had much more room for fitting third rail shoes. The third rail shoes could be raised when they were not needed. The FL9s also contained steam generators to heat the coaches. The New Haven Railroad ordered the locomotives with the intention of replacing all electric locomotives with the FL9, although the FL9s were much more costly and extremely underpowered when compared directly to those electrics. However, the locomotive was a success. The New Haven Railroad eventually replaced all except 2 of their electric locomotives with FL9, and even though 3 FL9s would be required to meet the performance of 1 EP5, the locomotives were definitely deemed a success, vastly outselling their competition, the Fairbanks Morse dual power P-12-42. The FL9s pulled all non-EMU passenger trains operated by the New Haven Railroad, and even pulled freight, although they did this with much difficulty. In 1969, the New Haven Railroad was merged into Penn Central, and the FL9 survived, and some were even painted into the Penn Central paint scheme. Penn Central based the locomotives out of Grand Central and ran them to Chicago and on to other destinations in northern New York, as well as in commuter service on what is now the Hudson Line. However, as we know, Penn Central failed and filed for bankruptcy in 1970. Penn Central would eventually sell 12 locomotives to Amtrak in 1971 for use on long-distance trains that would run out of Grand Central. Shortly after, 6 of these locomotives would be rebuilt by Morris Knudsen in 1978. The other 48 FL9s would remain in Penn Central commuter service, although the service would now be funded by the MTA, and some of the locomotives would be painted into an MTA paint scheme. However, in 1976, Penn Central would be dissolved into Conrail, and even though most people imagine Conrail as a freight railroad, they actually operated lots of commuter service, including Metro Norths. While under operation by Conrail, the FL9s would have their steam generators removed and replaced by diesel-driven generators to provide head-end power. The FL9s also had their air horns relocated to the roof of the locomotive and finally ditched the Hancock air whistles. However, with a struggling Conrail, state-owned agencies were forced to take over the unprofitable commuter service. The Metro North Railroad would be formed, taking the FL9s into the new railroad. The locomotives would be repainted again into 2 new Metro North schemes, and the 10 units owned by Condot would be painted into the original New Haven Railroad colors. In 1990, the locomotives would be turning almost 40 years old, and the MTA would start to seek a replacement for the veteran locomotives. That replacement would be the P32 AC-DM, which would be based on Amtrak's P40DC. To find out more about the P32 AC-DM, check out one of my other episodes on it. With more and more P32 AC-DMs entering Metro North service, the FL9s were retired from mainline duties in 1998. The locomotives had their dual-mode capabilities removed and were now fixed operating diesel shuttles and work trains on Metro North lines. The plan was to keep the locomotives in service until the arrival of the new BL20GH. However, with the locomotives delayed, Metro North had no choice but to keep these locomotives, which were approaching 50 years old, in service. The locomotives were becoming maintenance nightmares, which caused the railroad to lease 8 P40DCs from Amtrak to fill in for the failed FL9s. But shortly after, in 2008, the BL20H arrived and the P40s were sent back to Amtrak, but then were sold to Condot for service on Shoreline East. The retirement of these locomotives was on the horizon, so Metro North, Condot, and the Houstoniac Railroad ran a farewell to the FL9 trip from Stanford to New Canaan and back. Many locomotives are currently preserved in museums all over the world. All 12 Amtrak FL9s were bought by the Morristown and Erie Railroad, and 2 were sold to the Maine Eastern Railroad, and then those were sold to the Winnipeg Railway Museum, and currently in operating condition. The other 10, however, were scrapped. The Oxford Express in Quebec, Canada, has 1 FL9 in operating condition. The Connecticut Eastern Railway Museum also has 1 operational unit. The Railroad Museum of New England has 1 unit, the Danbury Railway Museum has 2 units, and Mass Coastal recently received 2 units. The Boston Surface Railroad Company also has 1 unit and plans on gaining more for commuter service between Providence and Worcester. The Berkshire Scenic Railway has 1 unit, and the Grapevine Vintage Railroad has 2 units. 6 of these locomotives still sit in New Haven Yard awaiting a sale. The FL9 operated for 50 years. It started out in the 1960s and ran all the way up until the 21st century, pulling commuters and long-distance trains on 4 different railroads. They were revolutionary in the 1960s and proved their worth in 50 years of service. Even though some of the locomotives were scrapped, a lot remain on tourist lines all over the country and even in some other countries. The FL9 is truly a legend when it comes to locomotives, but its legacy is still not yet over. And that is all about the EMD FL9. I would like to thank everyone that provided photos for the making of this episode. If you would like to choose what locomotive I do next, please vote in the top right of the screen. And feel free to leave any comments in the description and show your support by the FL9 by hitting the like button and subscribing. And I hope to see you soon in the next video. Goodbye.